Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's literary cocktail hour with Doug Wills in conversation with Peter Day. Today's the 18th of February, and some of you might remember that last year on the 18th of February, we actually had, thanks to the great foresight of the Livery Committee Chairman, I can't remember who he is, but we actually brought forward our VE Day celebrations to the 18th of February, and I worked quite closely with Doug and produced this this menu, which had the front page of the Evening Standard from VE Day. So what a difference a year makes. But first of all, can I thank everybody for joining us tonight? Thank you for your support. I see we've got a lot of new faces tonight, so I hope you're going to enjoy yourself. And it's thanks to these sort of evenings and our industry events and the Masters interviews and the Shrove Tuesday service and lunch that we had on Tuesday, that we've managed to hopefully keep you all feeling part of our great livery company. I know we miss each other's company, but as we begin to get vaccinated, I actually had my vaccination today. The day too is beginning to look a bit more promising, and perhaps, well, not perhaps, there's light at the end of the tunnel. So it won't be long before we can all get together and share each other's company. But in the meantime, tonight is the 7th of our COVID literary cocktail hours, and welcome to this Zoom meeting. In the past, we've restricted ourselves to authors that have been involved with the stationer's company, but tonight is a little bit different. Some of you might not have been aware of the authors or the books that we talked about in our previous events, but I'm sure everybody who's ever been to London, and I assume that's almost everybody, is aware of the Evening Standard, and that has been Doug's life for probably more years than he cares to remember. So please, charge your glasses, and I've got mine here. Charge your glasses, sit back and relax, and enjoy Peter in conversation with Doug. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, it is rather different. We don't have a book at the moment, but we may do sometime in the future, because it's a sort of preview, this event, of the book that Doug has just started writing after decades of the hurly-burly of deadline-infused life on Fleet Street, or wherever it is now. Doug, editor emeritus of the Evening Standard, has an absolutely classic newspaper story to tell us. But before we start that, Doug, I'd like to explain at the beginning of this hour what links the speaker up to the stationers. When did you join?
I joined in 2012, which was a significant year, and it was something that I was aware of stationers through my
newspaper makers.
Indeed, absolutely. Yeah. And that's something which I do keep making the point. So I've been aware of them for a number of years, including coming to the hall for some of the newsprint lunches and some dinners. And but I knew some of the work of stationers, including like the Saturday schools and supporting the industry. So I was aware of it beforehand. But yeah, it was 2012.
And you've gone up in the world in the stationers, haven't you?
Well, I'm on the court, which was a privilege, and I was very honoured to be invited to join the court. So I've been on the court for 2 years.
That's established you as a stationer. Let's go back to the start of you as a newspaper man. You were a school leaver in Wokingham, which is, yeah, a town that's kind of difficult to identify where exactly it is, but you know.
It's down the M4. About 32 miles, and I've circumnavigated the world by driving up and down the M4. So it's yeah, it's a dormitory town, sort of, but it's you used to have a strong identity and still retained it somewhat.
Because it's now part of what's become Silicon Corridor over the last 30 or 40 years, but it wasn't when you started, was it?
Not really, no, but I don't think Silicon had ever taken off anywhere when I started. I think Caxton had just about given up.
But it's remarkable when you go to these former market towns, how the international company names leap off buildings right in the centre of them now. It's an extraordinary transformation, actually, not very celebrated, I think.
I agree. It did have some future links. There was one of the companies in the area was Rakel, and Ernie Harrison, the boss there, he devised and invented and marketed the first mobile phone, and Vodafone was as a result of that. So it did have some links.
Tell us how you got into newspapers. You were a school leaver, pretty deliberate about it, weren't you?
Yes, it was almost by accident, but I soon became very enthusiastic with the idea. Basically, like most kids, I was mad on football. I lived and loved football, and I was sure I'd be a professional footballer because I was very confident I was a good player. But when it was broken to me that one careers evening that I might not make the profession, they said, well, what else do you enjoy doing? And I said, well, nothing really. Football's my life. And they said, well, you're good at anything else? And I said, well, you know, I'm okay at English. And they said, well, what about being a sports reporter? And suddenly the light bulb went off in my head. And I thought, okay, let me have a go at that. And so I then looked at what one had to do to become a sports reporter or a reporter. So that was the germ of the idea.
And it actually did arise from a careers evening. I don't know how many careers arise from careers evenings. That's
no, well, it did. It did really, but it was a strange way from there because I read up about it myself, and everybody told me I had to learn typing and shorthand. And so I went to the headmaster and said I want to do typing and shorthand, and he said, no, that's for girls. And I said, well, I want to do it. And he said, well, you can't. So I said, no, I really want to do it. And he said, well, if you go to the typing class, you'll have to do metalwork after school. So I said, okay. So I did that. So I went to typing with the girls at a local college in the afternoons, and then did the metalwork after school and technical drawing after school. And then I went to do shorthand in the evening at a local college with all the women who were going back to learn shorthand, Pitman's shorthand after having babies. So I did that while I was still at school doing my O-levels, as it was then.
That typing is for women is it has had a huge impact on the way computerization took so long to actually come properly into companies, because the bosses couldn't use a keyboard, so they had to have somebody else. They couldn't experience the full impact of the computer on their businesses for two decades or so, because typing was what other people did, not us. It's an extraordinary thing, though.
I have to say it turned my career and turned my life around, because I could touch type before I was 16, and the fact that I had typing and shorthand got me the job. When I went along, I was invited along to an interview with the local newspaper editor, and it was that fact that I'd had these and I'd shown determination to get them that got me the job.
This was the Wokingham Gazette?
Times, Wokingham Times.
The Wokingham Times, yes, and you learned the traditional way. You wore out shoe leather. You did a bit of, well, you got some background before you went. Did you have any formal training in journalism, or was it all learnt on the job? You were indentured, weren't you?
Yes, I had no formal training before my first day as an apprentice, and I then I was sent out to flower shows and graduated to parish councils, and including, well, not quite the one that we've seen the last couple of days, but not far from that. And but then it was indentures, and as part of that were block release courses at NCTJ, National Council for Training of Journalists. And after 6 months of learning how to use a typewriter in anger, as well as copy typing, I went on a 2-month block release course at Highbury Technical College, NCTJ course, and then came back to the paper. Then a year later, did another 2-month block release course. And so I learned it, as you say, through shoe leather. It wasn't so much parking and drive and park, it was a ride and lean the bike outside the village hall.
And it's a fantastic way to learn the rather humble job of being a reporter.
Absolutely, and you're working with people in the towns, and it's same for the cities if you're doing it in the city, where you have to go back the following week, and if you've made a mistake, you're actually hauled over the coals by the reader as well as the editor.
And of course, there was a fantastic ecology of local and regional newspapers in those days. Courts were covered, parish councils were covered. It was a very rich way, a very rich context in which to learn the job, wasn't it?
Yeah, very much so. And you did. And then the reporters went to events. They didn't just go on the telephone or send a tweet. You actually went to events, but that still happens in bigger stories, and importantly so. But definitely the apprenticeship, which I did, was absolute on the ground, and you learnt everything, warts and all.
What was that, 3 years of indentures?
3.5 years in those days, because I was quite young. So it was 3.5 years, and it was with a group, Thompson Regional Newspapers, which was a good group. So it did involve sort of a full structure of learning. So it was very good.
Yes, Thompson, Westminster Press, they took training seriously, didn't they?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Because they needed people for Fleet Street. Well, Westminster Press didn't have a Fleet Street newspaper.
Yeah.
But, that was the feeder, wasn't it? That was the way you learned.
Absolutely right. And a great many people, top journalists, top editors, did that route. They came through that route.
You managed to get out of Wokingham to go to the Reading
Evening Post.
I went before you were finished.
That's right. I actually, in those days, everybody was very cocky and very going for the big chance, and I was selling my stories to the national newspapers because I had exclusives, and we all chased our exclusives, and it was a good news area, and there were the stars living in the area, and Broadmoor Hospital, and a lot of good stories. And I was determined to leave to go and better myself and go up the greasy pole. And so they allowed me to go to the evening paper for the last 6 months. But then after that, I went down the M4, the other direction, down to Bristol, and went down as a political correspondent covering the City Council, Bristol City Council, and the new Avon County Council. It was a hotbed of politics down there. And at the time, it was Wedgwood Ben was the MP, and it was a gang of 4 politics. So it was Westminster, a microcosm of Westminster down there. So it was good.
Was that another Thompson newspaper?
No, it wasn't. I left Thompson's, and again, many people do this in the media, and certainly then, and still to this day, you actually have the loyalty is to one's career, and companies don't always fight to keep you, because as you were suggesting, you bring people on and then they move on and come back sometimes.
I'm dwelling on your apprenticeship because you're keenly interested in apprenticeships, and I want to come back to that later on. But you're sort of you must be about 20 by now, and
that's right.
You did politics in Bristol, and then you got a job back in Reading.
That's right. I was down in Bristol for basically 4 or 5 years, and did the Western Daily Press, and it was a terrific training ground because it was working with an editor called Eric Price, and he was a manic obsessive who came out of Fleet Street and took over that paper, and he trained more national newspaper reporters, sub-editors, and editors than any other. Because they went through, and he was a manic and violent man on occasions, threw typewriters at people, and if they hadn't written the story correctly. But you didn't make too many mistakes with him. So then I came back to Reading because I met a news editor who said, why didn't I come back? So I came back and took on a similar job, political reporting. from Reading, and then I stayed there for a good few years and learned a few of the editorial management skills there.
Well, the Reading Evening Post was a very interesting paper because it was part of a great plan by Roy Thompson to put a circle of evening papers printed in colour and web offset and things, really radical stuff for Britain at the time, because of the prosperity of the area around London. And I can remember being there before the paper started, talking to the new editor. He was your editor, was he, Howard Green, for a time?
No, he actually was a launch editor, but when I went back there, he was managing director, and with editorial background. But it was an interesting time, as you say. It was a very well-known newspaper, and it fought or battled above its status. And when there was a national newspaper strike, a provincial newspaper strike over pay, it was a 6-week strike, and he was the managing director, and it got very heated, picketing, and the journalists tried to stop the printers going in there. So he sacked them, myself included, and I was actually working in a restaurant, a transport cafe basically at the time, because I needed to pay the mortgage. And but I got sacked by Howard Green, and I still have the letter sacking me, and with all the others who were on strike. But the strike ended. He did take us back. And actually, you might remember the Green. His son was Damien Green, who went on to be a cabinet minister.
No. This was a very modern newspaper, and a rather good-looking one too, wasn't it?
It was, and it was modern and web offset, sort of, as you say, printing. So good printing, and we were at the forefront of the technologies when, because just up the road at the time in London, Wapping was going on, and that was a different type of industrial battle. It wasn't over pay, but over jobs. And the impact of technology, a technology which the Reading Evening Post had been founded on in 1965 or something like that. That's right. So when Wapping was the blood on the streets of Wapping, out in the provinces, including at Reading, the Thompson regional newspapers and the others were looking at how they could adopt the same technologies. And we know that one of the gains for the companies was that it vastly reduced the wage bill because it took jobs out. But that said, it saved the papers. And I know this argument will go on, and it lasted a number of years. But the print union fought the technology, and they were defeated at Wapping and lost their power base, and the journalists took on the technology and increased their power base. But the bottom line is, many believe that without that fight, without that change, the papers wouldn't have survived for another 20 years or more.
Now, while you were working your way up the greasy pole again in Reading, so you became a management person in Reading, did you?
Well, basically an editor. So I went from writing to features editor, then to news chief sub-editor, then assistant editor. As assistant editor, I oversaw the technology change and making it that it was possible that journalists could incorporate some of the technologies within their working.
And you then went out to translate this at other Thompson papers that were still printed in letterpress.
Yeah, we broke the back of it.
You were successful, and you then went on and showed other people how to do it within the organization.
Basically, yes. Yeah. And then that was an interesting time. I was in Reading for about 10 years for that occasion. But then London did grasp the future, and among those grasping it was a Robert Maxwell. And because Robert Maxwell, I sort of had come across from Reading and Oxford, and he actually tried to buy the Reading Football Club at one point, and we were campaigning to stop him doing that, and successfully. But he said he was going to launch the London Daily News as part of the Mirror Group, the camp, and he was recruiting staff. And it was a big operation. He was recruiting some 200 editorial staff, some very top names in writing names and editing names. And I knew somebody who knew somebody. And I was offered the position of a production editor, helping to get this paper launched based upon the new technologies.
Based on the stuff you picked up in Reading.
Yeah, and producing a paper. When I was hired, I was joining an evening newspaper. By the time I got there, it was a 24-hour paper, and it all to be launched in about 5 months after the time, and it ended being launching as the world's first 24-hour newspaper.
Just an aside at the moment, people are sending in questions. We've already got some. I try to read the bottom of the screen as I do this, and so do keep sending in more questions, particularly perhaps about the state of newspapers in the now and in the future, which we're going to come to in a moment. But the Daily News launched in what year was it?
It's 85.
85, and it was actually rather a good looking and rather a readable paper, wasn't it?
It was a huge investment in it, and despite Robert Maxwell, it was actually very editorially, it was successful, and it was a forerunner of a number of things, including listings, and it had in politics, and it led the way in some areas, but it was a bloody battle with associated newspapers, who of course were fighting to retain the dominance of the Evening Standard. Maxwell, it was an interesting meetings with Maxwell, and he did throw himself literally into this, as he did with everything.
That's 22 stone or something.
That's right, a sizable man. Yeah. And he did everything with no notice. As I say, he announced publicly it was going from an evening paper to a 24 hours paper, without telling the editor before and the staff. He then, on one occasion, and after the first week, he announced that we would do a Saturday sports edition, and we didn't have any staff. He said, well, we have to do it. We'll do it this Saturday. It was the start of the season, and we said, well, we can't. And he said, don't be ridiculous. Of course we can. And everybody worked 24 hours a day doing this 24-hour paper. And on the Saturday, Maxwell turns up at 3 in the afternoon on the floor, says, hey, no, what do you want me to do? Rolls his sleeves up. This is before any of the games had started. So there was nothing to do at that time. But he actually was a force of individual power. And but he didn't win the battle. Associated newspapers, long in the tooth, and they fought the battle hard, a little bit dirty, and defeated it. And after 7 months starting it, 5 months running it, the paper closed.
Say a little more about Maxwell, though, because he's in the news at the moment because of this hefty new book about him, which contains a lot of familiar stuff, but quite a lot of new stuff as well. He was a brute, wasn't he?
Absolutely. He was a bully. And he bullied his children, he bullied his staff, and he bullied politicians. While he had the power, he did it. And he gained the power each time. In Maxwell House in Holborn, he used to have there was the Mirror Group's building, and it was his building. And it was not unusual for him to have 4 meetings going on concurrently, him chairing all of them. and they were taking place at the same time. And he would go from room to room to room. And one of them was famously where it was negotiating between the company and the journalists and the printers. And he would actually say one story in one, go to the other, wind the others up, and then go back to the others, telling them what the others had said, and just force agreements through. He was a forceful character, and he didn't just do it through brute force. He was undoubtedly a good tactician, and he at one occasion I was with Peter Jay, who was the former ambassador to the United States, and basically he was his office boy, and he treated him like an office boy. So he was a terrible bully, terrible bully.
Exhilarating for a launch, I suppose, that sort of environment, that sort of atmosphere, but pretty wearing. You must have felt you'd aged 2 or 3 years in the 9 months or so. And you were there before it launched, of course.
It was the most exhilarating period, but we were aware that the Associated Newspapers had relaunched the evening news, and was charging 5 pence a copy, and were winning the battle. And the Standard and the circulation guys were doing some dirty tricks to stop the paper getting out. But there was a bit of a doubt as to whether we would survive. And then Maxwell called everybody together and said in his tones, "There is more chance of a cruise missile landing on London than there is of me closing the London Daily News." On that basis, I went on holiday, and I was away for a week, and I came back into Gatwick Airport, and as the plane landed, I got into my car, I turned on the news, and it said, "Robert Maxwell today announced the closure of the London Daily News."
Is that the one you have the headline and the Standard from?
No. I've actually, because that was the one battle that was at the time. And but it's not a new thing, you see, because prior to that, there was this one, which was the evening.
Hold it a bit higher, because it's out of flare. That was the
evening
news going, yeah. But it had a bigger circulation than the Standard, of course.
It did, and that closed in 1980. But when Maxwell launched his paper, the Evening Standard brought out the London Evening News, reborn, just to kill off the London Daily News. So it keeps being reborn. And,
right.
And I think the next battle after that was actually with Rupert Murdoch, and that was the battle with when Rupert Murdoch tried to do a Maxwell, and he tried to kill off the Evening Standard. So Rupert Murdoch launched in the early 90s, with mid-90s, sorry, with the London paper, and that was another battle that went forward.
That was very short-lived, though.
Well, not really. It was a couple of years in the yes, yeah, and the London Daily London Daily News was one of a paid-for battle, but the one with Murdoch, which was the London paper, was based upon a cheap or a free battle, and it was one that when he launched it, the Associated Newspapers brought an old trick. You remember we had the evening news. Well, what they did against Rupert Murdoch's paper was they brought out London Light, which was brought out as a cheap paper, and this one went through, and then it went out as a free paper. So it was aimed at again making sure that the market didn't grow and that they was retained.
What we've elided is you're joining the Evening Standard. You were rescued by the Standard when the Maxwell paper went down.
Thank you for saying that, and you're quite right. So when the Maxwell paper they went down with me on board, I worked with Maxwell for 3 months or so afterwards. But then I really didn't see myself sticking with his company or him. And I wrote to the then editor of the Evening Standard, who had successfully defeated him. And I wrote saying, I write with barefaced cheek, you beat me, but I think I can bring some of the tricks that were learned along the way to the Standard. And so I did. And I joined the Standard.
What did you join as? What were you doing then?
I joined in a similar role as a production editor, basically. And it was to help the Standard do the things that we had achieved at the Maxwell paper and at the Thompson paper before. It went from hot metal to journalists working on computer keyboards.
And this production editor is an absolutely key role, right in the firing line of everybody. Yeah. And you've got to get edition after edition on the streets to time, or you lose swathes of circulation. So it's a pretty nerve-wracking job, isn't it?
Yeah, it's adrenaline fixed, undoubtedly, and it is one of those that the training I had through from apprenticeships right through all elements that allowed you to get it on a ground level, all the elements that you know how to do it. And then going through the regions again, you know how to do it. So it keeps going through. But with the technologies on the Standard, there was a heritage there, and all the writers had to learn the new tricks. And there were even people like Brian Sewell, who's the absolute most brilliant artistic writer, and was revered by all for his writing. And I do remember saying with Brian Sewell that we've all got to do this, Brian. We've all got to learn to write on these electric keyboards into the computer. And Brian said, my dear man, he said, I am Brian Sewell. I could carve my words out of wood. I could paint them with a brush, and they would still fight to print them. And do you know, he kept on his old thing. He had a manual typewriter, and right to his dying day, and I love Brian, we got him famously, he would hammer it out on a manual typewriter and somebody would rekey it. And it was the only person I've known for the whole 30 years who actually defied the technology. But everybody else bought into it, and it transformed the operation. It transformed the willingness and the ability to turn editions around in no time.
Which you needed. You worked you worked with quite a lot of Standard editors, didn't you?
Yeah. Just on that, on the number, I'll show you one other page, which this was in the budget when Norman Lamont was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And it was showing that things could be done on the technology when there was no way of doing it prior to that. And this was on a single day. And we did this as a poster that went round all the tube stations. That was the first edition of the paper, saying I anticipated what was going to happen with the budget. And then these other editions were all produced during the budget. So each single edition was of a number of copies. And as the Chancellor was saying more things, the paper was changing. Now, today, that would be done on tweets, on going out on numerous websites. But in that time was the cusp of the technology, but still within the paper.
And you were at the heart of it.
Yeah, and that was with the first of the editors, and that was with the John Leese, who was the editor who at that time hired me. And then he launched the ES magazine. And then after John Leese came a certain Paul Dacre. And Paul Dacre came from the Daily Mail, where he was assistant editor. It was his first editorship. And Dacre, you say it's always good to have a lucky general. Well, it's good to have a lucky editor. And Paul, during his 15 months as editor, was at the time of the Gulf War. And he threw himself into this, as he threw himself into every single operation that he's done. And we increased the circulation by 16%. And largely, I think it was the Gulf War, which was the first live war that you could report in action. And he worked himself again, like we were saying with the Daily News. He worked 15 hours a day and built himself a career.
Did he learn to swear at the Evening Standard?
I think he brought that with him, actually. But the Standard, it was hard and tough, and he was and still is totally respected for being a dedicated journalist, and it takes no prisoners, and it's a bit of a theme of many editors, and people as Paul went on to the Mail, and he became more powerful, let's put it, at the Mail. And they are still a case of people say they've got the T-shirt if they've been sworn at on the floor by Paul Dacre. In 2005, you were managing editor and then group managing director. That was because the group changed, didn't it? Yeah,
well, I sort of takeover.
Yeah, sorry, because the editors come and go, and I was managing editor, publishing. Then I lost my brackets. I became managing editor, and that was with the Standard. But then the Standard was sold to Alexander Lebedev.
Wasn't it a shock when that happened?
Yes, it was. I was quoted to Reuters saying, "This is a spurious rumor. There's no truth in this whatsoever." And then the following morning, it was at 6 o'clock, I had a phone call from Paul Dacre, who was then editor-in-chief, to say it had been sold and could I get the staff together, and we announced it to the staff. It was a shock. And Alexander Lebedev, none of us knew at the time, as a Russian oligarch. He brought, the deal was brokered by a couple of people, including Geordie Gregg, who at that time was editor of Tatler, and it worked out very well. On the second day, Geordie said, Alexander would like to come in and talk to the staff, address the staff tomorrow. And I said, great. And he said, he's going to bring Mikhail Gorbachev. And I said, sorry? And he said, yeah, he wants Mikhail Gorbachev to talk to the staff. I said, you can't just say, do you mean me? Yes, yes, yes. Anyway, so he came in and elevated the paper's status and standing. But he said, and Gorbachev said, he translated him to say, that he would not interfere with the publication or the politics of the publication. And he didn't, and he hasn't. And Yevgeny Lebedev, his son, now runs this. And again, between them, they have not got involved in the shaping the politics of the paper at all. So it worked.
So that ex-KGB man really, that X really stands for something, does it?
The X does, yes. Because among the people he wasn't getting on with at the time was Putin. So it has been an interesting period.
And you were then group managing editor for quite a long time.
Yeah, because what happened a couple of years after that is that the Independent, which happened to be in the same building under different ownership, the Lebedev family bought the Independent as well. And that meant that the two titles could work more closely together. So I was then group managing editor across the titles. And that was an interesting say.
And it was all part of this daily rhythm of newspaper production, which is the news cycle is addictive, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and it is addictive, and most of the people involved are addicted to it. And the staff do have battles within the building themselves, and it's vying for positions, and always though the opposition, the other titles, and the digital has been a wake up. It was enabled journalism in newspapers, and then it was a wake up which has enabled the journalism to expand across all forms of media. And we now know the dangers, if you like, of not having a responsible and respected news media. And we're seeing things coming out from the States where Trump has led the field in accusing people of fake news. And we hope that the British public will learn that the reputable press, the traditional press, can deliver absolute truth, albeit of different political persuasions. So
well,
it's
political persuasions. You had George Osborne as editor when you were managing editor. What was that like? He's not a journalist, is he?
No. Interestingly, he applied for a job as a trainee journalist when he was coming out of university, and he did 6 months with internship, and he didn't get offered the job, so he went into politics instead.
So give him an editorship, I say. Well, what was it like though? Did it work?
When he came in, that was another surprise. When he came in and was appointed, there was deep skepticism among the staff, and everybody said, like you just said, what does he know? He shocked many of us because he could actually write. He's a good writer, and he can write leader columns and political columns very well. And when you think about it, that shouldn't have been a surprise at all, because he's been writing speeches, he's been writing, honing words for 30 years himself, I think, or certainly 20 years, let's say. He was came in, and he was able to bring in a knowledge, a background, contacts on politics that nobody else could have done. We were skeptical about his ability to know what was happening on the street, but he actually was more streetwise than most people gave him any credit for. But he certainly came in with an agenda, and one of those agendas was not exactly a fan of Theresa May.
Now times are now really hard for newspapers. COVID has kind of intensified that, particularly in the case of the Evening Standard, a commuter's newspaper. And there aren't any commuters at the moment, so that's real trouble. The Evening Standard's been losing money for 3 or 4 years now, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Things are looking rather dodgy for the Standard, aren't they?
It's hard. Just to recap on a few of those battles in the past, when the Maxwell paper, that was all paid for, when the money was over people paying the copies. Then with Murdoch, it went free, and the battle then was over whether the advertising would pay for the paper. And at that time, when the Standard went free, it did. It went from losing millions many millions to making money for a few years. And then the battle then was digital, and whether all the money would go to Facebook and Google. And there's been a bit about that the last couple of days. And so that was a battle. And during this time, all the publications, including the Standard, have gone to digital platforms as well as print. And then COVID. Now, if there is a lesson, nothing is ever secure, nothing stays the same, and everybody has to be versatile and change. And that's what's happening now. A year ago, the Standard went, when the lockdowns began, we overnight went to remote working from editorially, but overnight we started delivering 200,000 copies to homes. So that was done within a week from a standing start, and we've continued with that. So there are 200,000 copies that go to homes, and another 300,000 copies are still distributed and are still picked up around the city. And that's not in necessarily the financial city, but in the outer areas where there are still many people around and still want the paper. But it's advertising has been fallen dramatically for many. Digitally, it's been a success in terms of traffic, but advertising's down. So it's a battle. And
the trouble with running a digital operation as well as a print operation is that you're doing extra costs, quite considerable extra costs for your digital version, and the advertising isn't coming to either one of them sufficiently, is it?
No, no. And although the costing, if you get the operation right, the cost doesn't increase because the journalists are working across all platforms. They're working for print and also for digital. So we're back to this 24-hour working again. No,
you're a print person. Do you really think that print can seriously survive in newspaper, in news?
I think it can survive, but not as we know it. I think there will be niche publishing, and niche in national terms and in London terms can be millions, not a smaller number, and it still can. I believe it will survive, even if it is a shop window to digital. I think that's what will happen. The FT is an example of that. The FT makes most money and has far more readers on digital, but it still prints a print publication
at the moment. Yes, yeah,
correct, yeah.
Some people are wondering whether the time for changing newspapers with news in, I mean daily breaking news in, it isn't time to change the format entirely, the content and the format, into something much more like a news magazine than a frontline changing the front page headlines every few hours, that kind of thing.
Yes, you know, that's a definite school of thought, and it's a case of whether you do that with the existing publications or whether you launch new publications. But the brand is everything, they say, and it is a case of whether that can be done without losing the existing readers. It will change, fundamentally change. And as I said earlier, there was 5 editions a day, some afternoons, 5 editions in an afternoon. Now there are 2 editions, and it undoubtedly the trusted reader, the analytical writer, the comment writer is as important as the breaking news. The entertainment factor of publications is of interest. Various forms of platform there've been a renaissance, even in vinyl. There was a renaissance in vinyl, but that's niche. And but in terms of print, I think print will be around for a good while, but not necessarily as we know it. You know, and I take your point and the questioner's point.
Okay, let's talk about news then. We've already discussed in passing the changing infrastructure of the new news in the regions, the provinces, and the pressure on jobs in national jobs, and the migration to social networking and, I suppose, broadcasting. There's a big dent in how news is produced and is thought about now, isn't there?
Yes, one of the recent researches that was carried out by Reuters Institute showed that among the Generation Z and the under 25s, that none of them went to traditional news outlets. Not forget print; they weren't going to print, but they weren't even going to the what possibly you and I would think of as a traditional publications. They weren't going online to Mail Online, they weren't going to Telegraph, they weren't going to the BBC. They actually were just responding to peer notification links, or and whether it was actually tweet or TikTok. Well, it won't be TikTok as such, but it would be any of the other peer pressure mediums. Now, that is something which is a concern, and because it spread, that's where the spread of fake news or lack of appreciation can happen. And so it is something that with many of the industry organizations, Society of Editors included, are looking at this and looking at whether there is a problem in digital, and the Facebook stories that are going on right at this minute, and if Facebook and Google are taking the advertising, and if that depletes the resource for quality journalism, then it could be a vicious circle, and there are various efforts to be taken to prevent that happening.
What do you think about what's happening in Australia? Facebook's banned news there, hasn't it?
It's a standoff. It's a standoff, and it might go one of each way. Basically, the simple thing, which I'm sure most people know, is that the Facebook have said that because the government in Australia has supported the traditional media to say that they have to pay for the material, Facebook has said, well, in that case, we're not going to carry any of the news, because it was a means of driving traffic to the news producers. It's a standoff, and the criticism of Facebook is saying that this will play into the hands of those who I was just saying, who actually will not care about traditional news. They will, and it will feed the fake news brigade. It will feed the irresponsible lobbyists.
But what we're seeing is an attack on this traditionally named thing, the gatekeepers. You were a gatekeeper. You've been a gatekeeper. The fact that you needed a press to put out a newspaper, you needed an aerial to put out broadcasting. Don't need that anymore. Anybody can actually do it, can't they? And we've trusted those gatekeepers, or we've been familiar with them for an awful long time, and suddenly they are under assault. And this is a really, really big change in the way we do news, isn't it?
It is, and you can tackle it in one of two ways. You can either force the issue, or you can be not so much a gatekeeper as a purveyor of interesting, important material, and you make it such that people want to see it and want access to it. And that's the clever part, is to actually talk up and demonstrate the importance and entertainment and relevance. And if things are entertaining and relevant, then people will come to it anyway. And that's it's always been the way of journalism, that you know your market and you find a way of getting the market to want you. And nothing's changed with technology. That's still the base, the base challenge.
Mark Challoner asks, what skill sets are needed in today's newsroom? And that's a sort of
Yeah, in fact,
large question indeed.
Mark always has the ability to ask the hardest questions. It's basically the same as ever. It has to have somebody in a editorial floor now, has to know the readers, has to come up with brilliant ideas that will be relevant to the readers. But now they have to be able to do this on every platform. They have to be able to do it as know this social media and be able to do the social medias, and to persuade the bosses, those employing them, that they will be able to do it at a price, because everything is competitive now, but they will also be able to do it professionally and with sharp wit. And that's always been the way. It's always been the way. It's just that the different levels of skill, different
the
areas.
Generation thing now. Can anybody over 40 do that?
Indeed, and they do.
It's not in your bloodstream, is it? It's digital is still a curiosity to me.
Many people are doing this and can do this. The silver generation were the first ones because they had the time to get into it. No, I don't think it's always been an age thing as far as music or entertainment. So you have to know your audience, but that's not necessarily limited to skill sets. It's a disposition, it's a character.
Now, you're not managing editor anymore, you're editor emeritus.
Yes.
What do you do?
Some of the stuff that I've just been spouting about with the industries, to try the Society of Editors, the London Press Club, but also the campaigning and the Standard. In campaigning is something which I'm involved with, and that's we've raised £10 million plus for feeding London in COVID, and we've just started a campaign about increasing the numbers of counselling that's being done for young people who are finding mental health problems in COVID. So again, it's actually reacting. It's not news, as you say, it's reacting, and we've had enormous support for it. So I'm involved in that campaigning. But
you can do that all right, because you started this new role in November. I think you can withdraw from the addiction of the news cycle, can you?
I've still been seen to be looking at the odd news story. I got into the profession, and I never did become a sports reporter because I got addicted to news, and it was always a challenge to get exclusives, and it's still the challenge now to get exclusives. But also a good story to tell, and that's what it still is to this day.
We're running out of time, but you ought to tell us a bit about one of your other campaigns, which is apprenticeships, and you're actually doing that.
We have gone. About it. Yeah, thank you for that. We've gone full circle, and deliberately so, because for a couple of decades there weren't apprenticeships in journalism. Everybody went to Oxbridge, and it was going too far down one direction. And I managed to get the Standard and the Associated to adopt the apprenticeships, and since then others have. The Mirror have, the group, the News UK have, and others now are adopting apprenticeships, because for a couple of reasons, but you need a breadth of journalists within there, but also economically it's good for kids now, rather than to spend £30,000 on university. If they can come in and do the training on the job, it works as well. And that's something that with stationers have supported, and also the diversity journalism, to bring in journalists from a diverse background, ethnic and social background. So yeah,
I've taught some of your apprentices at stationers at stationers events at Helen Esmond events, and they're impressive and keen, and they're learning on the job, which is a very potent thing to do.
Yeah, and the one of the apprentices was Avianca, and Avianca has just become a freeman at the end of her apprenticeship, and Avianca has done some very tough journalism on the streets of London, and she also did the exclusive Zoom interview with Prince Harry. So she is a case in point of somebody who can do the whole breadth of journalism, and is an endorsement.
I've got 3 questions from her, which I'm not going to ask like that, but I'll finish with a question that kind of sums up her questions.
Okay.
And that is advice for people wanting to be journalists now. What on earth do you do?
You start from whatever age you are, writing and doing blogs, doing vlogs, and just get your name out there. You become a pain by contacting everybody, and you actually just do the groundwork and the legwork, and you just keep at it. You're just determined and keep at it. And as you said, there are no gatekeepers now, so you can start doing that yourself.
But I mean, do you think about, you don't think about print or digital or something separately? You think about opportunities. Is that?
Yeah, that's correct. And in fact, nothing is separate. If you are successful in getting an apprenticeship or a training position with any of the publishing groups, it will be multi-platform. It would not be a single platform, and that's the need and the skill. And that's what's needed. So it's same as before. You just merely try harder, because there will always be a closed door, and you find a way of opening it.
And what's that behind you on that headline? Is that a typo? Helen Edmond says.
No, I don't think so. There's a couple of behind. I've got a couple of front pages. One is when we actually took the Standard to New York and printed it in New York, and Boris was out there handing copies of it out in New York when he was mayor. And the other was Charles and Camilla. They wanted to see their local paper, so they came round and spent the day meeting everybody at the Standard. So no typos on these.
Right, thank you, Mike, ever so much. That was fascinating. We could go on longer, but journalists always can to each other.
Indeed.
But I won't. I'll hand us back to Mike.
Thank you for an excellent interview. Thank you for doing that.